Good morning. It's Saturday, May 25th. I'm Charles Coleman Jr., filling in for my friend and colleague Ali Velshi, and we've got a lot to talk about. In just the last 7 days, Donald reminded us of the many reasons why he remains a danger to the Constitution and overall to democracy itself. Let's start when the former president appeared in an NRA convention in Texas. During a speech, the Republican Party's presumptive presidential nominee asked the crowd, quote, "Are we going to be considered 3-term or 2-term?" Now, some can interpret that to mean that just because Trump continuously is delusional and believes that he won the 2020 election, a possible victory this year could be considered, in his eyes, a third presidential term. For others, it raised concerns that Trump might be floating the idea of serving more than 2 terms, which is something that he also slyly suggested at a couple of rallies during his presidential campaign 4 years ago. There are a lot of things I could say about this idea. Aspirational, presumptive, even perhaps bizarre. But I'll keep it pretty basic with 2 words: highly unconstitutional. See, the 22nd Amendment explicitly forbids that. On top of that, he's called for the termination of the Constitution and said he would only be a dictator for 1 day of a possible second term. The guy is a walking, breathing constitutional crisis waiting to happen. And then on Monday, concerns about his authoritarian tendencies resurfaced again. People noticed that there was a video that was shared on Trump's social account that suggested victory would lead to, quote, the creation of a unified right. That's a term that is often associated with Hitler's reign in Germany, and it's very serious. The post has been deleted, but it was still a reminder of Donald Trump and what his campaign's many previous dog whistles to white supremacists have been and will be going forward. Amid all of this, the former president rapidly promoted an absurd conspiracy theory that President Biden ordered the FBI to assassinate Trump when the agency did its search of Mar-a-Lago in 2022. A number of his allies also irresponsibly spread that same conspiracy on television and on social media. But there is absolutely no truth to that lie. It's a lie that has been debunked before, but it still hasn't stopped Donald Trump from fundraising off of that lie because, again, that's what he does. That's his jam. Meanwhile, turning to our venerable judiciary, the Supreme Court's credibility took another hit this week. The New York Times reported that a second flag that's linked to the far right and the January 6th insurrection was displayed at a second home belonging to Supreme Court Justice Samuel Alito. Alito's apparent political bias is under serious scrutiny again during a critical time for the High Court. And believe me, this matters, perhaps right now more than any other specific moment that we can think of. Why is that? Well, because soon the justices will issue a pair of important decisions that could affect Trump's federal election interference case, and that could have major implications for the upcoming election. I'm joined now by Ruth Ben-Ghiat. She's a professor of history at NYU, author of the newsletter Lucid, and author of the book Strongman, Mussolini to the Present. And Jennifer Rubin, she is an opinion writer for The Washington Post and an MSNBC legal analyst and author of Resistance, How Women Saved Democracy from Donald Trump. Jen, a second provocative flag at a second Alito house. Does this surprise you, or is it just blowing in the wind?
I have to say, I'm so glad I'm on with Ruth because her Strongman book is no longer history, it's journalism. It is an explication of exactly what is happening every day. These people are shameless. We should believe what they say verbally and symbolically. What Alito is saying is, I am not bound by the normal rules of judicial ethics. I can identify with an insurrectionist movement that is seeking to overturn the Constitution that I have taken an oath to uphold and to apply. That's how shameless, that's how out in the open all of this is. And what is really the problem here, aside from people like Alito, people like Trump, is that the people who are in a position to do something about it consent. They go along. Chief Justice Roberts does nothing. And Republicans do nothing when Trump talks in these authoritarian ways and makes these claims of conspiracies and violence. And because we have a core group that is promoting violence, authoritarian rule, disrespect for the rule of law, and we have another group of people who are enabling them, we come to the point of a constitutional crisis. And that's really what this election is about. Are we going to reestablish a constitutional framework in which not only the president, but the people around him take responsibility for reinforcing the rule of law? Or are we going to, in essence, go down an authoritarian rule where anything goes, might is right, and there are no restrictions on those in power?
Jen, that is such an important framing, and I'm glad that you set things up that way. Ruth, I'm always glad to talk to you. I'm just happy because I have twice mislabeled your book on air, and I finally got the title right today, so I'm just happy about that. Justice Alito, he said that the upside down American flag, that was his wife's mess up. And he hasn't commented about the second flag at all. Ultimately, we know that he doesn't have to do anything about this. There are no boundaries from an ethical standpoint other than impeachment, which we can pretty much rule out at this point, for Supreme Court justices. What does this tell you about the current state of the U.S. judiciary, and how concerned should we be given where we are?
Well, very, because fascism isn't a day job. It requires you, excuse me, it requires you to not only have far-right rulings if you're a Supreme Court justice, but to actually show through your personal conduct that you scorn and discredit and delegitimize the institutions of democracy. And that's what's happening. And it's also Justice Thomas refusing to recuse. That's personal conduct, even though his wife, Ginny, was involved in trying to overthrow the government. So, you know, this is a very purposeful act, both the flying of the flag and also refusing to be apologetic about it, blaming it on his wife. This is all purposeful because you have to demonstrate loyalty to the public if your goal is not just to have far-right rulings, but to actually wreck democracy by delegitimizing the most important institution of democracy, one of them at least, the Supreme Court.
Ruth, I want to stay with you because you have the historical context about this arc and where things go. Do you think that returning to some degree of normalcy in terms of what we expect, does that responsibility fall on the electorate, or does it fall on the actual institutions to say or to recalibrate and say, no, this is what's normal and what should take place?
Well, institutions are made up of people. And so Jennifer was very correct to call out the enablers, the people who have to be the ones to intervene at, excuse me. The people who have to intervene at crucial points, and this is a crucial point. This is an inflection point. So Justice Roberts, the people who are supposed to have the guardrails for us. We can vote, but institutions are made up of people. And, you know, all these things you mentioned in your setup are actually connected. So with the assassination claim that Biden's tried to assassinate him, what you need to do, and this is like in my book, autocrats have to create a crisis. And to get people to be okay with violence and be okay with autocracy, you have to give a sense that not only the election was stolen from him, he's already done that, but that his actual life is threatened now. You get people into a state of existential fear and dread, and then they'll accept him coming in as the kind of dictator. And that's what that relates to that video where he's depicted with there's all these strange allusions to World War I and talk about World War I in that video, as though he's setting himself up to be the new Hitler who comes in at this moment of crisis and saves us. So all of this is very disturbing, and the more you know about fascism, its aesthetics, its ideologies, the more you see what is going on.
You know, Jim, when I talk to people, oftentimes I hear what I like to describe as a very willful ignorance when they talk about Donald Trump. They say things like, well, he says a lot of things, or he said this and that was a mistake, or he was joking around, or you can't take him seriously. You talk about the fact in your Washington Post piece this week that these were not gaffes. These are not mistakes. These are not things that are being said on accident. So how do you respond to the folks who say, well, he says a lot of stuff and you can't take everything seriously, and, you know, he can't mean everything that he says that you guys are saying are so problematic and troubling?
Well, I think the best evidence is that he's done it. He talked about his victory, which was non-existent in 2020. He talked about the people not standing for it, and he led a violent insurrection. So when he says something, he means it, and he does it. Now, we can point to history and say that these dictatorial figures usually advertise what they're going to do, and then they carry through. And democracies and democratic peoples are often deaf or willfully ignorant, as you put it, to the threats. But in this case, we don't even have to look to history of the 1930s. We just have to look to 2001. This is what Donald Trump does. And I think this willful ignorance is really an equal problem for us. And I would just add on the subject of Alito, the problem also resides with people like Senator Durbin, who makes a tweet, who writes a letter saying, please recuse yourself, or will you come and have a meeting? He actually has power. He has the power of the gavel. He could call a hearing. He could demand Alito appear. He could call experts on judicial ethics. And he could put his bill that he's been working on for over a year on a mandatory set of ethics for the Supreme Court. He could demand that it go to the floor. He's doing nothing. So I don't want to make this a whataboutism or both sides are responsible. But in this case, there's a direct responsibility from another branch, which right now is half controlled by Republicans, half controlled by Democrats, and the Democrats in the Senate are abrogating their responsibility. I will have much to say about this, by the way, in a piece for Sunday. So if your viewers are interested in hearing more, please read my column. That's my shameless plug for the day. But it's a real problem, because when Democrats don't rise to the occasion, Republicans say, see, no big deal. Everything goes on as normal, and the press moves on to the next issue.
Well, I am looking forward to reading the piece, as I'm sure many of our viewers are as well. Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Jennifer Rubin, thanks to you both.